All right, so good evening. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. My name is Eric Austin. I am the director of the Burton K. Wheeler Center, and I am also a member of the political science faculty here at Montana State University. We are really glad that you could come out and join us for this evening's lecture. If you are not familiar with the Wheeler Center, the center was actually initiated as a series of lectures in about 1975 to honor the late senator. Senator Wheeler served Montana from 1923 until about 1947. As I said, the center was started initially as a series of lectures in his memory. In 1988, the center was established to expand the programming that we could undertake. And since 1988, we have been involved in producing lectures, in conferences, supporting research, policy and roundtables and panels. The Wheeler Center is the only statewide policy center in Montana that is focused on really the whole breadth of issues that are of concern to the citizens of the state. And it's kind of under that mission and under that vision that we are really excited to bring this lecture together and to do that in partnership with the ACLU of Montana. As with any event like this, there are a wide range of folks that have been involved in helping bring it about. And I need to, before we sort of kick off the formal comments tonight, acknowledge some of the support and help that we've got and that we've received in bringing this about. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the board from the Wheeler Center. There are a couple of folks here. If you guys could raise your hands and make your presence be known. It is really the vision and the energy of the board, not only today, but throughout the history of the center, that has driven activities like this lecture series, like our conferences, and that continue to push it into the future. I said a moment ago that among the things that the center does is produce conferences. Our next conference, so that you can keep this in mind, will be focused on divisiveness in politics. And thinking, apparently a timely opportunity. And we will, yeah, right. And no, not only will we be focused on divisiveness in politics, it is in September of this coming year, so it will be at the height of divisiveness in American politics. But our goal with that event is to bring folks together and to begin to talk about and think about how do we engage folks in a functional democratic discourse, particularly young people. How do we get the next generation of folks engaged so that we can have functional conversations, so that we can have effective, productive conversations in all sorts of policy venues, whether that's in legislative bodies or in other policy venues as well. So we're really excited to be working on that. Keep your eyes open for it. Again, we have had an enormous amount of help and support in this, and I want to also acknowledge the ongoing relationship that we have with Montana State University. The center, since its founding, has had a tradition of the sitting president of the university being a member of our board. And although she's not able to join us this evening, President Cruzado has been a real tremendous advocate and supporter of the center, has been an energetic participant in board conversations, thinking about our strategic plan, thinking about the future of the organization. But even beyond the relationship that we have with the president and the administration of this university, we have been fortunate to work with units and colleges across the campus. From the College of Architecture, this past fall, had the opportunity to work with the College of Education, Health, and Human Development to produce a conference on early childhood education. And then especially the College of Letters and Science, where I am located, which we have worked with closely over our many years of experience. This last fall, we're able to provide some support to the College of Letters and Science in their inaugural lecture series on Western lands and peoples. The second year of that will start this coming fall, so keep your eyes out for that. But we're grateful for the support that we receive from the college, and particularly from Dean Nickel Ray. And finally, and very much not the least of which, I want to recognize the help and support that we've received from the ACLU of Montana, and really thank them for reaching out to the Wheeler Center early on in the planning process and giving us the chance to work with them. And we've worked really closely hand in hand in bringing this together. So couldn't have accomplished this evening without their support, and that's been really enormous. So without further ado, I want to move towards Mr. Romero's comments this evening, but I want to invite Dr. David Single to join me, or to come up, take the mic, the Associate Provost, and say a few words on behalf of MSU.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. I have to say that I'm not exactly happy to hear a forecast that it's going to be more divisive in September than it is already now. I hope things settle by then. Eric told me a story today, and I'm sure I have this wrong, but my understanding is Burton Wheeler became a senator of Montana because of a card game. And and he lost, is the key point. Having lost the card game, he became a senator of Montana. I think there's a great story in there somewhere, but I'm sure I have this wrong. So Eric mentioned I'm Associate Provost, and I'm here on behalf of the university and really the Office of Academic Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to speak on behalf of the university at this event, to welcome guests, members of the board, faculty, staff, students, and to thank all the people, especially Eric, whose hard work has made this possible, and all the people whose generous support makes events like this possible. Montana State University has a long history of being known as agricultural mechanical school, agricultural and engineering, and more recently, it's developed some recognition as a STEM school. But I love events like this and collaborations and work like this. Work with organizations like the Wheeler Center, we reach a further dimension in academics at this place. Engaging with the center in the enlightened discussion of public policy, we enliven many other academic disciplines, especially in the humanities and social sciences. And with that greater reach, we stop being an agricultural, mechanical science school, and we become a university. And that's a great pride and something that you all have helped to accomplish at MSU. And that reach, that's perfectly aligned with our fundamental land-grant identity. Scholars serving communities by integrating learning, discovery, and outreach. And I'm especially pleased with the ACLU on campus. As a university, we have deeply held values that we hold in common with ACLU, an unwavering conviction that free discourse is essential to everything. As scholars, as teachers, as public servants, as citizens, this is just absolutely indispensable. So it's a great pleasure to make this welcome. Now I will introduce the introducer of tonight's speaker. Tonight's lecture will be introduced by the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Montana, Caitlin Borgman. Caitlin is a graduate of Missoula's Hellgate High School and went on to receive her BA in philosophy from Yale University. We were talking, her dad is a philosophy professor at another school in the state of Montana. She pursued a law degree at NYU and then joined the faculty at City University of New York, where she was professor and director of faculty research. Her affiliation with ACLU goes all the way back to 1990. You were 5 at the time, I take it. And as an intern, she has since served on the National Board of Directors since 2008 and has been back in Montana since last summer. Welcome home. Welcome to MSU.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Eric and the Burton K. Wheeler Center for co-sponsoring this event and having Anthony here at MSU to speak. So I'm the only thing holding you from hearing about Anthony, but I do want to say a few words about him. Anthony is the 6th executive director of the National American Civil Liberties Union, which will be turning 100 in 2020. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce him because I knew Anthony. I was working at the National ACLU in the Reproductive Freedom Project when Anthony came on board. That was in September of 2001. And if September of 2001 sounds familiar, yep, 1 week after he started, 9/11 attacks happened. And really was a game-changing moment for the ACLU. It was obviously a trial by fire for a brand new executive director, but he immediately launched our Safe and Free campaign, which really changed the national dialogue around what happened in the United States following those attacks. We brought successful challenges to parts of the Patriot Act. We exposed the U.S. treatment of torture and abuse of detainees. Following that, he did many other things which I'm going to tell you about, but it won't surprise you that he's been successful if you hear a little more about his personal background. Anthony is the first Latino and openly gay man to serve as the executive director of the ACLU. He grew up in New York City, was born in New York City to parents who hailed from Puerto Rico. And he was the first member of his family to graduate high school. He then went on to graduate from the Princeton Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs, and then got his law degree from Stanford. He presided over an amazing array of really creative and groundbreaking civil liberties, court challenges, and policy campaigns. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. The ACLU's unique challenge to a private company's holding of a patent over human genes associated with breast cancer and ovarian cancer. The ACLU's leadership in providing for same-sex couples to be able to marry across the country. I know you're going to hear more about tonight from Anthony about the campaign to end mass incarceration in the United States. But Anthony has also been incredibly visionary in focusing on the structure of the ACLU and making it a much more effective and national organization. So the ACLU at the time that Anthony joined did have affiliates across the country, but he was the one to really recognize that although we were strong on the coasts, the middle of the country was kind of full of a lot of civil liberties battles going on, but affiliates that, like Montana, had one executive director, maybe a legal director if they were lucky. So he launched what was called the Strategic Affiliate Initiative, where strategic affiliates across the middle of the country were supported with financial resources and other resources to be able to become more effective. Montana was one of the first beneficiaries of that program, and that's what enabled us to expand our staff to what we are today and to really increase the capacity of the ACLU of Montana to fight for and promote civil liberties across Montana. So he has been an incredible resource and mentor and supporter of the ACLU of Montana, and it's such a privilege to be able to introduce him.
I don't think I need to use that microphone, is that right? I'll just use this one. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I want to thank especially Dr. Singal for that wonderful welcome to Montana State University. It's been a sheer delight to be back in Montana after, this is my third trip. I feel like I'm a resident of Montana. For a New York City kid, I'm beginning to know my way around. The mountains are everywhere. But I really do appreciate the hospitality here at the university, and to the Wheeler Center in particular. I want to thank you for co-sponsoring this event with our colleagues. It's remarkable, the history of the Wheeler Center. When you think back to the history of the senator, very much tied to the early beginnings of the ACLU. In the early 20th century, the red baiting that went on, the Palmer raids, we were in many ways wrought from the same fire. And so it's really remarkable and particularly gratifying to be with you at the Wheeler Center. And to Caitlin, I want to say a special word of thanks for her work here, for that very kind introduction. It's always the introductions that make me want to believe in censorship. I'm otherwise a very strong First Amendment type, but I really appreciate, more importantly, what Caitlin's done, both in her career for the ACLU, in the national office, and now here for the ACLU of Montana. And I'm especially thrilled that Caitlin has chosen to come back home. And in so doing, I think she debunks many of the long-standing myths among parochial Easterners like us, that there are, like me rather, that there are two countries, right? The coast and then the country in between. And that we often think that there's not enough in common, that there's such difference that you either ride or fly over or deride the middle of the country. And yet by Caitlin's willingness to come back to work where she grew up, helps debunk those myths. It helps emphasize our differences. It helps emphasize our similarities rather than our differences. It helps show that we can be united in a search for progress and solutions. It makes clear that good, passionate, committed individuals can be found anywhere and everywhere, and that the prairie and the mountain states in particular have a long history of a strong libertarian streak and a questioning of government power and authority, which I think is quite resonant and quite important in a time when we need to demand more from our government. And third, I also think that because the challenges we face as a country are not that different from place to place. They may have different faces, different manifestations, different causes, but many of the same challenges are the ones we confront, here in Bozeman or in Brooklyn. And if we're not willing to look at where the common challenges and where the common solutions might lie, we might not be as effective. Tonight I wanted to focus my remarks. I wanted to present a proper lecture. It is a university with a very large podium. I feel that when you're done with this, you can ship it to me. I could use it as my casket when I die. But since it is a proper university, I prepared a proper lecture for you. And I wanted to frame my remarks for you tonight to talk a little bit about the concept that's not found in the law books or in statutes. It's not found in the Constitution, but it's the concept of redemption. And I feel that it's a concept that is an explicit component of how we live our lives, both at the legal level and every day as we rub against one another. That it's an essential value of American society. That redemption is a powerful and necessary part of our national fabric because it gives all individuals who have done wrong a meaningful opportunity to do right. And it gives us as a society a chance to benefit from their efforts to be redeemed. And this is not just an abstract concept. This is something that most of us, all of us, I dare say, have lived and experienced in our everyday lives. Which one of us has not understood the importance of the power of those words that are just sometimes so difficult to get out? The words, I'm sorry, I let you down. Wish I had done differently. Which one of us has not felt the importance of being able to, God, I got to clean that up. I have to fix that. I did wrong. I got to do right. I know better. Which one of us has not understood the importance of asking for that moment of forgiveness and redemption and we don't wish to be judged by the very worst act that we have done on the worst day of our life. And so in our core, in our bones, in every way that we have lived, this core value has often inspired us to be better and bigger people in our everyday lives. That very same value needs to be mined in the context as we think through our criminal justice system and our legal system. And a criminal justice system that does not recognize that people can repent and that society can benefit from that redemption is one that fails our public and fails the people swept up in the criminal justice system. According to Joseph Stalin, there's this legend that he said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is but a statistic." And here in the United States, the American Gulag now contains 2.2 million people behind bars. The United States locks up nearly 700 of every 100,000 of our residents. We are the world's largest jailer, and our incarceration rate is more than 1/3 higher than the country of Russia. We possess 5% of the world's population, and we detain 25% of the world's prison population. Now, you don't have to know much about recent American history to know that this isn't just some accident. We didn't just end up here by happenstance. It really has been an epidemic of incarceration that has been constructed after decades of conscious policy making and lawmaking that has led to this human tragedy. And it stems not from the political crimes that Stalin would have defined as his prisoners, but they do descend from domestic American politics. Politics that gave us the war on crime, a cynical attempt to win over white moderate voters who were scared by black activism in the 1960s and 70s, and has since been reinforced by countless local, state, and national laws produced often by cynical legislators of both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, trying to prey on the fear of the public. You've heard the rhetoric. Sometimes it's been dog whistle politics, where it's shrouded in some type of metaphor, where we talk about predatory gangs, or we talk about the inner city crimes. Sometimes it's been more explicit. You've played the Willie Horton card. You've played the card of 3 strikes and you're out. Lock them up and throw away the key. You did the crime, you do the time. All these metaphors, all these shorthands that have been part of our public consciousness have been used to reinforce the idea that we should be tough on those who broke the law. The war on crime was soon followed by the war on drugs. You remember that. Nancy Reagan, just say no. Ronald Reagan, often enacting very strict anti-drug laws. And the war on drugs, equally suspect, brought a whole new class of nonviolent offenders into brutal prisons by design. Some would call the war on drugs the new Jim Crow, that purposefully and by design targeted minority and low-income communities for incarceration. On top of that, today you find thousands more are incarcerated simply for the fact of being poor, thanks to a resurgence of debtors' prisons, of individuals who are incapable of paying court-ordered fees or fines, fueled by lucrative government contracts given to for-profit prison corporations that deliver large dividends and investment earnings to shareholders because they have locked up as many people as possible and done so to benefit their profit margins rather than the public. Now, this isn't just an abstract policy or a wonky debate around laws and policies. It's actually when you have 2.2 million people who've been now incarcerated. It's a tragedy that has real human consequences. And so I thought I would introduce you to a couple of the people I've come across in my travels who help paint the human face of the epidemic of incarceration. The pipeline into the system. Take the story of Craig Cecil. In 2013, we issued a report called A Living Death, Life Without Parole for Nonviolent Offenders. And we featured the story of Craig Cecil. Craig is a father of two, and he owned a truck repair business that also he rented out trucks on the side for people who had small errands to run, like man with the van, if you will. He would rent out the trucks. In the spring of 2002, Craig went to retrieve a truck that he had rented out to two individuals who, unbeknownst to him, had used the truck to transport marijuana and then abandoned the truck along a kind of a desolate roadside. When he went to claim his property, the truck, he was arrested and charged with being part of a conspiracy to transport and sell marijuana. Even though he didn't have anything to do with the conspiracy, he had no idea why the fellows had rented the truck from him. He had never bought, sold, or even used marijuana. And yet he found himself caught up and snared in this conspiracy charge. Now, looking at a very long stretch of a criminal conspiracy case with felony charges, of several felony charges that would run consecutively, he was given the very bad advice by his attorney that he should just accept, of a court-appointed attorney, that he should accept the plea bargain, and that the plea would require him to testify against the other conspirators. The real problem was, though, that Craig wasn't part of the conspiracy. He didn't know anything about his so-called co-conspirators. He didn't know the details. He couldn't deliver the goods. And when he tried to withdraw from the plea deal, the judge forbade it. The conspirators, who actually did commit the crimes and did willfully try to break our laws, each of them were sentenced to sentences between 5 and 10 years of incarceration. But because Craig followed the advice of his lawyer, and since Craig could not deliver on the plea deal, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And because it was a plea deal, Craig Cecil could not appeal that charge. So now he's 14 years later. Craig remains behind bars, where we spoke with him. He speaks weekly with his two daughters, who were 14 and 10 at the time when he was arrested. He never expects to see them again. There's no chance of a second chance unless we change the laws that govern cases like Craig's. He is a very despondent, broken man who says to us, "I hope to die sooner rather than later." That's what he says. Now, it's easy to become a statistic in America, especially if you're black and male. The ACLU conducted an in-depth analysis of marijuana arrests in all 50 states and the District of Columbia for the prior decade. And we found that, among other things, there was a staggering 8 million marijuana arrests, 8 million people arrested for marijuana between 2001 and 2010, 88% of which were for mere possession. Now, even though black and white communities and black and white individuals use marijuana at roughly the same rates, that the research shows that white students at a different university are just as likely to use marijuana as black students at another university, a black person is almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person. The racial disparity exists in my own native New York, the state with the highest rate of marijuana arrests in the country. But even here in Montana, when I looked at the data tabs on the research for Montana, where marijuana arrests are less than 1/2 of the national rate. So that is to our credit here in Montana. But a black person in Montana is 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, looking at the demographics. And while nationwide analysis tend to highlight the black and white disparity, data from states like Montana and others with a large Native American population draw a similarly large disparity in marijuana possession and arrests for Native Americans compared to whites. Now, what does that mean? It often means, for racial minorities, that their families, their communities, their lives, their jobs are severely disrupted and they're punished for doing something that many white Americans also do, but with very little consequence. Take the case of DeMarcus Sanders, another one of our clients that I've met over the years. DeMarcus Sanders was profiled in that report I cited about marijuana arrests and the racial disparities. DeMarcus Sanders was pulled over driving in his local town for playing his music too loud. The music was apparently very loud and the cop was irritated by the loud music. Pulled him over, and because it was a proper stop, he was able to search the car. DeMarcus did not object to the search in the car. And once they searched the car, they found that DeMarcus was in fact carrying a small amount of marijuana, which led to his immediate arrest. As a result of that marijuana arrest, and started because he had the music too loud and the windows down, DeMarcus Sanders lost his janitorial job, which he had held for several years. He was incarcerated, unable to post bail, without the resources to post bail, lost the credit for the college classes he was in the middle of, but unable to attend because he was in jail, and then unable, because his driver's license was revoked, to take his son, who had chronic asthma, to his weekly doctor's appointments. And his son got sicker and sicker and sicker as it got more and more despairing. Now, it's hard to pay your fines if you don't have a job, if you lose your job because of your incarceration. It's hard to find a job when you can't drive to a place. And DeMarcus Sanders, living in Cedar Rapids, doesn't have a very good public transit system. And so he was left with very little alternative other than to watch his life and his job, his college classes, his son's health slip away from him merely because of one small marijuana arrest. Now, in our America, you don't even have to commit a crime to end up in jail today. That you have this resurgence of what I thought was utterly unthinkable, something almost medieval, where we lock people up merely because they're not able to pay their fees or their debts. So, introduce you to one of my most heartbreaking of clients, Edwina Nolan from Escanaba, Michigan. Now, she was working to try to find a way to get out of a temporary homeless shelter where she and her 15-year-old son were living. The problem was that her son got picked up by local police officers, also on a low-level marijuana possession offense. And because he was being prosecuted through the juvenile justice system, he was 15 years old, the local court system in Escanaba required Edwina to pay the amount of money that it cost the state to transact the case of her son through the juvenile justice system. So she was court-ordered to pay $104 of legal financial obligations, a court supervision fee for her son's case. When she couldn't pay that $104 because she was living in a homeless shelter, they threw her into jail for 30 days. She comes out of jail. Right after getting out of jail, she gets a job at a local Wendy's, goes to work for an entire week, picks up her paycheck for $178 for a week's work. Keep track of the math because it's important. She owed $104 as court-ordered fees, couldn't pay it, got out after 30 days, went to work for a week, got $178. When she went down after cashing her check to the local county clerk's office to pay the $104 and to get that monkey off her back, they said, "Oh no, Ms. Nolan, you owe us the $104. But because we had to take care of your son when you were locked up in jail for 30 days and put him in social services, you owe us an additional $120 room and board for your boy, and another $22 for a drug test that we gave your son, which he passed." And so you add up the numbers, 104 from the original fine, 120 for the room and board for her son, $22 for the court-ordered fee, is what, 248? But her paycheck was only 178. So they threw her back into jail for 30 additional days, which is when someone in the local jail said, "You got to call the ACLU. They'll try to help. This is crazy." So she called us. We were able to win her release on the grounds that she had been sentenced unconstitutionally without an assessment of her ability to pay, and denied her court-appointed attorney. Now, it's hard to imagine a more Kafkaesque situation than the one she confronts. That you're locked up because you're too poor to pay the court-ordered fines. And then when you're not able to pay the fines, and you do the 30 days, and you come back out, and you get a job, and you go first thing to pay the fees, and they tell you of an additional fee, and then they lock you up again. It is Kafkaesque. And it's happening in our very modern-day America in places like Michigan. And what happens when you get to jail? 2.2 million people. That's over twice the entire population of the state of Montana. That's behind bars, right? An entire state, twice over. What is it like in many of these prisons and jails? The LA County Men's Jail has an average daily population of 22,000 prisoners, the largest jail system in the world. It was built for a population 1/4 that size. And since 1985, the ACLU has been suing left and right this LA County Men's Jail for the poor conditions of confinement, for the overcrowding, for the violence, for the lack of health care, for the lack of proper assistance. And as a part of our litigation and a part of a court-ordered consent decree, they have to grant us access to the jail on 24 hours notice. And so all we have to do is give them 24 hours and say, "We're coming in tomorrow," and they have to give us carte blanche to walk through the LA County Men's Jail to observe the conditions. I've been through the jail now twice in my time at the ACLU. It is the worst jail I've ever been to. I've been to Rikers. I visited the New Orleans Parish Prison Jail after Katrina. I've been to Guantanamo half a dozen times. This is literally the worst jail I've ever seen in progressive, blue Los Angeles County. The hypocrisy of it all. The overcrowding is evident. The general dorm, general ward, which are the prisoners that are either supposed to be pre-adjudicated, that means they're innocent until proven guilty, are housed in rooms that hold 250 men per room. The bunks are 3 bunks high. The guards do not patrol the interior of these rooms. It's much too dangerous for them. They patrol through the perimeter, where there are windows where they get to observe the hell that breaks loose in these general dorms. There's constant attacks, gangs, fights, violence, rapes. You have 250 men in an open auditorium. They're all crowded there. They take every single one of their meals in their dorms. There is no cafeteria, no room for a cafeteria. They take showers twice a week. They're entitled to 2 hours of recreation time, which is on the black tar-matted roof of the jail with high chain-link fences. And it is scary to walk into one of these general dorms, as I did. You go from the general dorms where they're wearing dark blue jumpsuits, you go to the sex offender ward. This is where I thought I would be perhaps most troubled. You know, the idea of individuals charged with preying upon kids or sex offenders. And I was utterly struck by the youthful nature of the faces of the defendants in the sex offender ward. There were a lot of very young men who looked to be 18, 19, 20 years old. Many of them allegedly having relations with underage girls. And so because he's 18 and she's 15, they're charged with statutory rape and put in the sex offender ward. The vast majority of the people I saw there were not what you would typically visualize when you heard sex offender. You saw so many of our young men who were just there. They were wearing white jumpsuits, and because they are labeled as sex offenders, they are often subjected to the greatest of violence, both from the other prisoners and from the guards. The violence being so rampant and so wanton and so indifferent that the ACLU lawyer, whose job it is, which we could never pay her enough to do this job, to monitor this prison twice a week. That's her job, is to go in and take the stories, take the narratives, what happened now, who got beat up, who. She was an eyewitness to 4 guards beating one of the individuals in a white jumpsuit into a coma. Now, when they beat a prisoner within eyes distance of an ACLU lawyer who is on the premises, and they are so indifferent to her presence there, they don't even try to comport with the law. They do that with an ACLU lawyer right then and there. You can just imagine what it's like when we're not around. You go from that ward, you go to the high-value detainees, borrowing the language from Guantanamo, who indeed do wear orange jumpsuits. They are truly some of the most shocking of cells. They're shorter than this podium. They're 3 feet wide, 5 feet long. Not allowed to enter into their cells because they're supposed to be the most dangerous of the individuals. You can't even see their faces through the mesh, the very dim one bulb in the back. All you see is a silhouette. They don't ever interact with other individuals. They're basically locked up in solitary confinement. You go from there to the disability ward. It's on the 3rd floor of the facility. And in the disability ward, you have individuals with both physical and mental disabilities. And when I was in the disability ward, an older man said, "Come with me, son." I just looked at my colleague and said, "I'll be back," and I'm not, call somebody. And he wheels over to the end of the room, and he wanted me to push him up the ramp, which was too steep for him to muster the strength in his arms in the wheelchair to go to the urinal, to go to the toilet. This is in the disability ward, where the ramp is of such a high grade that the very own disabled prisoners cannot access the toilets in the facilities. Then you wander through the halls, you see the guys in the green jumpsuits. They're the ones who are let out with better liberty within the jail, often mopping the floors, running errands, transporting materials between different parts of the jail. And as I'm rounding the corner out of the infirmary, I see a fellow in a powder blue jumpsuit. I said, "Okay, dark blue, general ward. Green is greater liberty. White, sex offenders. Orange, high-value detainees. Gray, disability ward." So I walk up to him and I say, "Sir, can you tell me what your powder blue jumpsuit means?" He says, "Oh, honey, I'm a homosexual. I'm part of the homosexual ward. This is my outfit. I said, well, how do you feel about that, sir? He said, what, you mean my pink triangle? You mean my dartboard that is on my back? So that whenever I walk down the hall of the LA County Men's Jail, anyone in the jail knows who the faggots are. And it's open hunting season on us. And it's remarkable that this is done in LA, in the great bastion of progressive liberal politics, with your and my tax dollars. And it's hard to imagine a greater recipe for disaster and for brutalization of a community of people. Jails are meant to be places that house people who are innocent until proven guilty, pre-adjudication. Individuals who might not be able to afford to post bail, but who have not been deemed yet guilty. So they're likely to be thousands of innocent individuals who will ultimately be found innocent of the crimes of which they are charged, who will have been subjected to the brutalization of that experience. Now, how could you imagine that not being a brutal experience when you have so many people crammed into these squalid jails? Violence is inevitable. You have a pervasive culture of savage violence, of prisoner on prisoner, on guard on prisoner, guard on guard even. You have an environment where people's mental illnesses, when they come in, get worse, where people whose spirits are flagging get broken. And in a culture of brutality that even if they're lucky enough then to get released, scars them for life, and they carry that scar and that anger and that violence into the communities in which they go back to return. And then what happens once you get out of one of these facilities? Imagine for a moment that you're one of the millions of Americans arrested on a minor drug offense, and that you've managed to survive the brutality of the detention. That by some miracle you're still able and still wish to be a productive member of society. You think it would be easy to redeem yourself. You think the legal system would make it simple for you. But if you read the statistics about recidivism, you ask yourself, why will people commit the same mistake twice? And that doesn't make a lot of sense. Until you look at how hard it is to actually gain that redemption. Another one of our clients, Jessica Cipione, a New Yorker like me, was busted in 1988 for cocaine possession. She served 7 months in a federal prison in New York. Upon release, her right to vote was automatically restored in New York State, and after her sentence was completed. Then she moved to Florida, where the state has taken the practice of voter suppression to the highest of art forms, and where she was permanently disenfranchised from voting, unless she filed a petition to have her voting rights restored. While in Florida, she decided to go to law school. She applied, got accepted, went to a local law school, matriculated in 2008, learned that upon arriving in law school, that unless she had her voting rights restored, she would not be allowed to take the bar exam, that she needed to restore her voting rights as a prerequisite to entering as a licensed attorney. So as a first-year law student, she said, well, let me get on this. This might take a little bit. She applied in 2008. When she graduated in 2011, 3 years, her application was still pending. Now, in between, a cynical governor had changed the rules. Before, she would have to submit her application. It was rather automatic, time-consuming. The more cynical governor came in, demanded a case-by-case review, even though 99% of all the people whose petitions for their voting rights had been restored ultimately over time. Now, unable to take the bar exam because she didn't have her civil rights restored, and $200,000 in student debt, she was unable to secure a job. She fell into a financial hole out of which she was never able to climb out of. She and her 2 sons moved in with her dad in federal government-assisted housing. When she finally got her voting rights restored in 2013, she couldn't get a job. People kept asking her, well, you went to law school in 2008, you graduated in 2011, what have you been doing since 2011? 2 years? We all know that those first jobs right out of school are some of the most important jobs that get you on the right path for your career. That if you take a 2-year hiatus from your new training as a lawyer and don't have a bar license and have not worked as a lawyer, it's going to be very harder and harder to get a job the further out of school you become. She's never been able to get a job as a lawyer. She's worked as hard as anyone ever has. She is the case of redemption. She did the crime, did the time, came back, put herself on her feet, put herself through law school, graduated, and we never gave her the chance to redeem herself. Now, a young person today in many of our colleges and universities with a single nonviolent felony drug conviction will find themselves forever ineligible for federal student aid. Forever. A parent with a felony conviction will find themselves forever barred from living in federally subsidized housing. Now, how can you possibly have a chance at redemption if you're put out on the street with no money and no prospects, when a released felon can be barred even from living with a family member in federally subsidized housing? How can you find a job when you don't have a closet to hang the clothes for your interview? How can you find a job if you don't have a home or a telephone number where an employer can call you back for that second interview? The way stations for redemption have been closed off to some of the people who need them most in our country. And it is an utter tragedy that has to change. Luckily, it's begun to change in the political climate we now see. We have made criminal justice reform our top organizational priority. We work on all the issues: freedom of speech, church-state separation, women's rights, abortion rights, LGBT rights. First among equals is the need to reform our criminal justice system. We believe that because not just of the magnitude of the problem, but because we think this is a unique opportunity where we can find common ground with individuals who had not been with us before. We're working with individuals who are progressives and liberals. We're also working with some very conservative right-wing leaders. We are finding common ground with the Koch brothers. We are working with Ed Meese. We are working with Grover Norquist for Americans for Tax Reform. Ed Meese, who often despised and often labeled us as the American Criminal Liberties Union, now agrees with us. And I have always to stifle a very kind of strong impulse to smirk when in those meetings. And we find that it's not just some of the elected officials or the conservatives or liberals, but it's also the American people have finally woken up, and basic common sense says, yeah, something's wrong. This doesn't make a lot of sense. When we did a national poll just in June of this year that polled Americans all across the country and looked at both Republicans and Democrats, independents, we found that 81% of Democrats said that reducing the prison population had to be a top priority for our country, that 71% of independents and 54%, a majority of Republicans, said that reducing the prison population had to be a top priority. You find that even in places that are conservative jurisdictions, that there is support for retroactively changing some of these sentencing laws. We enacted and helped push a ballot referendum in California that passed by a margin of 60 to 40%, winning even in places like San Diego and Imperial County and the Central Valley, winning majorities in those communities where you retroactively reclassified a dozen former felonies as misdemeanors. So you took away the stigma of being a convicted felon for nonviolent property crimes and nonviolent drug crimes, and you turned them immediately into misdemeanors. So you never were a felon. With a wave of this ballot initiative's wand, you took a former felon, you just made them someone who had a small misdemeanor. You didn't have to petition for your voting rights restored because you never lost them. We think that that very same approach can be used in other places. We're doing exactly that same type of ballot initiative approach in a place like Oklahoma, where we're working with conservatives in Oklahoma and libertarians to put this question to the Oklahoma public about whether or not to retroactively reclassify former felonies as misdemeanors. Now, I'm not saying that every prisoner should be released or that every person can be redeemed. But I am saying that, that the United States of America is a great nation because we give people a second chance, because we believe the idea has been embedded in our culture for many more years than just even the short history of even our country. That redemption and forgiveness are essential parts of how many of us were brought up, whether atheists or agnostic or believing. That they were parts of how we view the way which we interact with each other. That second acts, second chances, are part of the DNA of our country. That many of the immigrants who fled the tyranny of Europe or fled the potato famines or fled economic uncertainties came here seeking a second chance. We are, in fact, not just a nation of immigrants, we are a nation of redeemed immigrants. And so we need to double down on this core value, restore it, resuscitate it in the way that we think about the debate of our laws and policies. President Obama, when he went to go visit with the Oklahoma El Reno Federal Penitentiary, the very first president who ever visited a federal penitentiary, when he came out, he had some very kind of poignant and often off-the-cuff words that he shared. He said, quote, "When they describe their youth and their childhood, these are young people who made mistakes that aren't that different than the mistakes I made and the mistakes that a lot of you guys made. The difference is they didn't have the kind of support structures, the kind of second chances, the resources that would allow them to survive such mistakes." And as a child who grew up in New York City public housing projects, I too know people like the ones that President Obama met at the Oklahoma Penitentiary. I can see it among family members and cousins and kids I went to school with. Good, smart kids who came from very fine families who somehow got off on the wrong foot, made a couple of mistakes, maybe even one or two of them, and found their lives completely in a downward spiral out of which they were never able to be given a second chance. I understand that these mistakes are ones that we have to give ourselves and each other the opportunity to bounce back from them. And I wanted you to hear these stories of the individuals tonight so that when you read these press reports and you hear about these political pundits who are playing tough on crime and your eyes want to glaze over and you just want to mute the channel and say, okay, let's see what's on Antique Roadshow, right? Or when you glaze over the idea that, oh, it's just another statistic. It's 2.2 million people. How are we ever going to fix this problem? It's just too big. It's too intractable. It's in the communities. It's not their fault, but the violence is in the communities, and it's just part of surviving in the urban jungle where people make those mistakes. Whenever you begin to think that it's time to get cynical or tune out, I want you to remember the stories of Craig Cecil, right? Life without parole because he rented a truck to guys who transported marijuana who'll never see his two daughters. I want you to think the story of Marcus DeSanders playing very loud music, happened to have a blunt in the ashtray that he forgot about, found himself losing his job, losing his college credit, not able to take his kid to his doctor. I want you to think about Edwina Nolan, if nobody else, right? This poor mother trying to get out of a homeless shelter, not able to pay fee upon fee upon fee because her kid made a mistake who was 15 years old and locked up for 60 days because she was too poor to pay those fees. I want you to think about the guy in that blue jumpsuit. Just the kind of the cynicism, the bitterness, the resignation, the brutality in his interaction with me. You got to think about Jessica, who tried to give it a whirl, who tried to redeem herself and become a lawyer and yet was denied that chance at a second act. And just when you think it's all going to become too hard or too difficult, remember those faces and then take a look at the closest mirror and take a look at your own face and take a look for a moment and say, there before the grace of God could go I. And then remind ourselves and each other that we need to redeem redemption, not for their sake, but for our very own, if for nothing else. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take your questions.
Why would an innocent person ever plead guilty? But the individual stories talk of a much more pragmatic approach to life.
Yeah.
But they could wind up in this mess by voluntarily telling the court system they're guilty of a crime they're not.
Yeah.
How is that addressed?
Yeah. I think part of what we have to do in order to make the plea bargain system actually work, because the plea bargain system has to be a part of the process. You can't just say no one can plea to the accusations. But you have to have a couple of things, I think, that will make that plea actually real and effective. You have to have good court-appointed counsel, right? So the idea that an individual who's confronting with a jail sentence, and this was an ACLU case, the right to a court-appointed attorney if you can't afford one. Gideon versus Wainwright, that was our case many years ago. And that was a Supreme Court decision that's been enshrined in the law books, but not enshrined in reality in many local jurisdictions. And the way it's worked is that we let state by state, often sometimes county by county, determine the process by which they will provide a court-appointed attorney if you can't afford one. And that means in some places you don't have access to a court-appointed attorney, either who's competent or until it's way too late. We have a case, a lawsuit right now, John, that in New Orleans, where we were invited by the New Orleans Public Defender's Office to sue them because they said, we can't do our job. The caseloads are too high, we're inadequately resourced, there are too many pressures put on us, and we cannot provide our clients proper advice in this process. And so I think an important part of how we have to fix that is by providing for greater resources for truly making good on that promise. If you're too poor and are facing jail time and can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you, that a good counsel will be appointed to you. The second one, the second problem that often gets people is money bail. Now, bail was never meant to be kind of a punitive fine, right? So when I speed, not very often, but when I speed and I'm a little bit higher than the speed limit and I get a ticket in a place like East Hampton, I pay it. It's a fine. You know, it's like, yes, I should have been going 35 and not 40. Thank you, officer. Have a nice day. But often when people are charged with minor offenses and they come up before a judge, the judge will automatically impose bail no matter what. And for poor people, the inability to post bail because they lack the money or lack the assets that they could leverage to post that bail means they go back into jail until their case comes up. And much of what we've been trying to do is to demand the right to bail is an essential part of our constitutional rights. And if you're not able to pay that bail, the judge has got to kind of figure out the circumstances by which you can get either let out or determined about whether or not you can get let out on your own recognizance. And very often, bail was meant to be an impediment from the person fleeing the jurisdiction. But if you have kids in school and if you have a house and you have a job or you have a place where you live, those are factors that the judge can look at and say, look, I don't need to ask you for $5,000 bail because you were carrying marijuana. I can let you out on your own recognizance. And in fact, the research shows that people who are let out on their own recognizance do in fact come back to contest the charges, and often are vindicated in the process. Now, but if you don't have access to a good lawyer, and you don't have access to bail, and you're sitting in that jail cell for 30, 40, 50, 60, 90, 120 days in some circumstances, before you actually get to the heart of the matter, and the court-appointed attorney says, look, just plead to the lower offense. Just plead to a kind of plead guilty to a lower crime, and let's just get this done behind you. And you get out today, and you say, sure. That's the worst that's going to be imposed upon me is already the time I've served in jail. The problem is that record follows you. And if you have a second infraction or another offense, and if you're not able to pay the court fees that are often imposed upon you when you leave, that then can also lead you back into jail. And so I think you're exactly right, that many people don't fully understand the whole posting bail and the whole access to lawyer, access to counsel component that leads folks to often agreeing to plead guilty to crimes they didn't even commit. And that's part of the problem we have to fix. Other questions, comments, please.
Would you talk a little bit about the profit motive in the correctional system?
Yeah.
Specifically, the growth of private prisons in the United States.
It is truly one of the most pernicious and cynical developments. I don't know enough about the state of Montana, but I do know, like, for instance, in the state of Arizona, one out of every 4 jail beds is run and operated by a private prison corporation. Now, private prison corporations are corporations of shareholders who build and run facilities, turn a profit, that is, that they get more money through government contracts than they spend on the services, and then distribute that profit to both their corporate leaders and to shareholders. There are 4 ones that I am aware of. The 2 large ones are the Correction Corporation of America and the GEO Group, publicly traded on the stock markets. You can pull up their prospectuses online. I encourage you to do so. It will give you a chuckle. The GEO Group in particular, they have holdings in foreign countries as well of America. And so they have these aerial shots of prisons in Britain, in South Africa, in Ireland, that look like Club Med destinations. And they talk about state-of-the-art health facilities, state-of-the-art recreation facilities. And our counterpart organizations in a place like South Africa is in fact suing the GEO Group for the abysmal conditions of one of their facilities just outside of Johannesburg. The profit motive is very simple. You have these corporations that say, we will take these prisons off of your hands, state governments, local officials, state governors. We will run them more efficiently for you, and we'll do so to your benefit and at our profit. What you won't be clear about unless you do the research, and we've hired actually a series of private investigators and investigative reporters to dig into these corporations, which is part of the reason why we've begun to know so much about them. Part of what they do is that they hire lobbyists who often come from, who are either retired state legislators or retired law enforcement officials, to then serve as their lobbyists to gain the government contracts. So they're hiring people right out of the government to go back and lobby the government for these government contracts. As part of the contracts, they will often require the state to guarantee a bed quota. That is, we will run your jails and prisons, but you will guarantee us, Mr. Governor, that the beds will be filled 30% within the first year and 80% within the third or fourth year. So they will require the state to fill the beds as a way for them to turn their profit. Now that creates a perverse incentive on the cops to arrest and detain and fill the beds to make the quota. And it's truly astonishing when you think about the idea that individuals are making money off of our tax dollars, because there are our tax dollars who are now being given to these private corporations as government contracts, as a way to deal with our public welfare system. Now, I think the greater scrutiny we can place upon them, you should certainly look at your mutual funds, your IRAs, your retirement funds. You can ask your TIAA-CREFT or Fidelity or Schwab if any of your underlying funds have holdings in the CCA or the GEO group. If they do, you can begin to ask them to, you can petition them. We have begun to petition our own investment holdings, our own pension plan. We've instructed our investment advisors to ensure that they withdraw any holdings in CCA and the GEO group. If you want to keep your holdings and become an activist shareholder, we can help you. The idea is you can show up at a shareholder meeting and really make trouble is really fantastic. We've done that in a couple of instances. I think we also have to be engaged in the process of naming and shaming the individuals who are both employed by and benefit from these private prison corporations. There is one individual who serves on the board, a paid board, corporate board seat, of the Correction Corporation of America, whose name is Thurgood Marshall Jr. His father was the father. And Thurgood Marshall Jr. is a paid corporate board member at CCA. I know Thurgood. I've met him. I would sometimes consider him a friend. I think it's shameful, so I take the opportunity to shame. And I think we need to do that more and more openly, because ultimately the pressure has got to be placed on our governments to retract these contracts. The final thing I'll say that's very interesting, the states that haven't had the rise of private prison corporations have ironically been the states where you have strong prison guard unions. So in California, for instance, you don't have the flourishing of private prisons because the sheriffs and the prison guards and the warden unions are too strong, and they've kept them out. So we've begun to find common ground. We are an equal opportunity foe, and we are an equal opportunity ally. So we're actually working with the prison guard unions as an effort to try to shut down the private prison corporations. They're often some of the same people we fight against on the prison conditions and treatment of prisoners. But on this one, we can find common ground. And I do think it's something that is, I think for the students in the room, this is something you should ask your university about how much are they invested in the Correction Corporation of America or the GEO group. Divesting from coal, divesting from fossil fuels, divesting from private prison corporations. It's not that much more to add onto the agenda. That you'll forgive me, Assistant Provost, but I think it's, I want to make sure that there is good activism that we can do. Please, in the back.
The most clear message that I got.
Please tell me your name, please.
Dan Lurie.
Hi.
40 plus year ACLU.
Thank you very much.
Worked in both white and black poverty communities. The lesson for me from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which I presume you've read and many of your people have read, is the degree of despair that there ever would be or ever has been any measure of equality from the legal justice system and from the police system. And I wonder how or if the ACLU can address that, for me, a revelation, even after a long lifetime of considering those issues.
I think individuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates, whom I greatly admire and have known for a number of years, even before his most recent book, I think they play an important role as public intellectuals, as leaders of a public conscience, to talk very clearly about the problems, the challenges, the despair. And I think it's important that for white communities and for empowered communities and communities that don't struggle the way that minority or low-income communities struggle, to hear that despair so you can contextualize the activism, at times the anger, at times the rhetoric. I think it's incredibly important to kind of paint the context of why you have people who are as vocal and as vigorous and sometimes as in your face as the Black Lives Matter movement, and why they have come out that way is not because they're angry people who just found each other. You know, that these are people who were made angry by the systemic violence and the indignity and the injustices they suffer day to day. I think it's an incredibly important contribution to help us understand the context. As an advocate, I don't find cynicism useful. There is nothing useful about cynicism. And I completely understand, appreciate, and acknowledge the fact that there is systemic racism in the police departments, that there's been impunity, that police officers have acted like this for decades, and nothing has happened for too long a time. But I cannot fall to the point of saying that it's always been like this and it will always be like this because of the kind of racism in our country, because ultimately that leads you not to a path of change or of reform. I actually think that some of the very same kind of depictions of this is intractable and this is, you know, this has always been part true is true. I mean, police brutality in minority communities has been around for a very, very long time. What's changed in this context has been the emergence of these devices that we all carry, where you can actually film a cop shooting a kid in the back with his hands up, and it's no longer having to take the word from the people who live across the tracks saying, you know, they shot him and he was innocent. Right? You always heard those statements. Now you don't have to say those statements. You just post the videos. And now you have publics who are waking up and saying, wow, that's not right. And I think that alone has helped move the debate forward. I think that alone has helped demand a level of accountability that's just beginning to enter, I think, a level of maturation, which might come a very long way. I'm very proud of the work that the ACLU has done, both in courts. The thing we've done that I think is sometimes as innovative and not as well known is that one of the things we developed was this thing called the Mobile Justice app, right? So for free, I think through the iPhone store, for free, it's not a commercial, you can download in different states this Mobile Justice app. And it walks you through what are your rights if the police should stop you. How do you assert your rights? Gives you tips on how to do it in a respectful manner so you don't get yourself clubbed by the police officers. It gives you some guidance. It also has a recording function. So it tells you if you wish to record this police interaction, press this button, and then it will record it. And then when you're done, it will send it in to the ACLU local office, right? So we've piloted this in about 17 different states. It's been downloaded tens and tens of thousands of times. One of the most recent clips that I got that I thought that was, I don't get them because I get a lot of things, but I don't get all these videos. Someone else gets these videos, but once in a while they send me one, they say, I want you to check this out, Anthony, this will make your day. There was a police officer who was arresting a young African-American man in LA. And one of his friends pulled out his phone and hit the Mobile Justice app and then said, hey cop, you know, you're being filmed with the ACLU is gonna get a copy of this video, right? And he just held it there. And the cop continues to put the cuffs on the guy and read him his rights. And in the middle of it, the police incident, he says, how am I doing so far? And he looks at the camera and smiles. Now, he might have done that anyway, but I think if there's a way to serve as a deterrent, I think the use of body cameras on police officers, you know, just like dashboard cameras served as a way to ensure that cops didn't beat people up when they pulled them over. I think the more transparency and accountability of law enforcement officials, I think we will ultimately push it to a point. I also don't think we've ever seen a broader public recognition of police brutality and the need for police accountability, as we've seen over these last several years. It's just with the deaths of Eric Gardner, of Trayvon Martin, the eruption in Ferguson, there is a kind of a public something qualitatively different about this debate around police abuse and brutality than the ones we saw in the 80s or 90s or 2000s. And so because this debate seems to be much more vigorous, much more youthful, often multiracial, I tend to be more optimistic than Ta-Nehisi Coates, although I very much admire him. How about other questions? Please, sir. What's your name?
My name is David Steinmuller. I'm also a very long-time ACLU member.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned prison guard brutality, and it's not uncommon to read about this in news media. And I imagine the average inmate doesn't have a recording device. Is this a subject that ACLU has looked into, varying standards, requirements, training, racism?
Yeah. The prison guards often are some of the individuals who can make all the difference in the world of whether even a bad facility turns awful or whether a bad facility can get better. And so they're the frontline soldiers. And so even in an overcrowded system with poor resources and inadequate health care and overcrowding, if you have a good, well-trained prison guard cadre, they can make sure that it doesn't go from bad to worse. If you have a bunch of thugs as prison guards, it can make that sheer chaos. And so the very same LA County Men's Jail that I referenced, it's just, I could talk too long about that particular facility. There was I believe a 60 Minutes documentary. If you actually Google LA County Men's Jail, guard gangs, see what pops up. I think that's the way to look for it. There was a documentary that showed that the guards themselves at the LA County Men's Jail were organized into competing violent gangs with each other. Like the Bloods and Crips on the inside, you had Guard Gang 1, Guard Gang 2, Guard Gang 3, and they would beat up on each other. And they would foment violence in each other's wards. And so you just say the entire ecosystem is a Superfund site. It's just got to be closed down. You got to start from scratch. And I do think that one of the things we have to do is look closer at holding prison guards and prison wardens accountable. And I'll tell you one anecdote of another client I've met over the years. Roderick Johnson was a young African-American man in Texas. He served, I think, in the Marines. Gay. And when he got out of the Marines, he met a boyfriend who was not good company for him. And he found himself committing 3 small misdemeanors in the state of Texas, right? So I think the last crime he committed, that he was serving as a golf caddy at a golf club, and he stole 3 golf balls. And that was his 3rd misdemeanor, and 3 strikes, you're out in Texas. So he was sentenced for a felony conviction that had, I think, almost 2 years of jail time, and sentenced to, I want to say, the Elbert County facility, one of the worst facilities in Texas. Upon arrival at the facility, he tells the prison warden, I'm gay. What can you do to protect me? And the prison warden said, oh, you need to find yourself a husband who will protect you, right? And threw him into the most violent ward in the whole facility. That same day, he was gang raped, sold from gang to gang, gang to gang, from the white skinheads to the black gang, to the Chicano gang, to the Nazis, violently raped by tens of inmates. His sister finally calls us and says, my brother's about to commit suicide, you've got to help him. And we get down there and we are able to meet with him and then isolate him in a way that they should have put him in protective custody to begin with. And then we brought a series of, and the thing that was so, not to be, I don't think there are too many children in the room, not to be overly gruesome, but the thing that allowed us to bring this lawsuit against the guards and against the prison warden himself was because every time he was so brutally gang raped, he was brought to the infirmary, and there were rather detailed medical notes of the physical impact of those violent rapes in the prison health facility. So no one could say that didn't happen. We ultimately went and we sued. We actually were able to get some of the prisoners to point the finger at the guards who turned their back when they were raping him. There were some guards in the facility who observed the rapes and who let it happen. And since the prisoners actually don't like the guards, they were all too quick to point the finger at them. And then we were able to bring lawsuits against a number of the guards, including to the prison warden. And it was a trial for damages, right? We couldn't do anything else. He was already out at this time. We tried to sue them for intentional infliction of emotional distress and some of the harm caused to him. We lost that jury trial. We spent, I don't know, $600,000 bringing that case. And as part of any good jury trial case, you interview the jurors after they render your verdict against you. You try to learn, what did we do wrong? What could we have done differently? Why did we not win? And as we interviewed the jurors in Texas, they said, oh, we believed him. We believed the fact that he was raped, and we believed that the guards let him be raped. We just didn't want to award him any money. And that you walk away and say, huh. You know, we tried to pick as good a jury as we could, but sometimes juries in these very kind of racially polarized environments are never going to be places where African-American homosexual men who were victims of violence because they were criminals in a detention center, where I argue he should never have been there to begin with, are just not going to award the guy money because of his trouble. So I do think that, so we keep at it. Part of what we do is there was one other case where we actually won against a guard. It was very exciting. You put the fear of God in them. If you sue an individual guard for rape, the one we won was against a guard who was transporting women from a detention center and raping them in the transport truck when he was taking them to the court. We won, and we won. The man is broke. We got his pension plan. We got his house. We got everything, right? Too bad, in my mind. What it did do is that it put the fear of God in the other guards, where they're like, oh no, I don't want to lose my pension plan or my home or all of my savings. And so to use it as a deterrent to ensure better behavior of what should never be allowed in the first place. Why don't we take one last question, if you have time, and then we'll wrap it up. Hi.
My name is John Schellenberger. What kind of problems are there with the mainstream media in getting these stories out? What kind of problems do you encounter?
You know, I think the mainstream media is increasingly paying some attention to it. I think we work very hard to place these stories when we're able in the large outlets, and kind of the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR. There's often such a limited amount of space, and unless it's tied to something that is very specific, the newspapers prefer to pass over. There's been I'm not sure if you've seen it, but the New York Times has been really fantastic on covering the violence in Rikers Island, because it's the state penitentiary in New York, and they've done full page spreads. Often we've given them names of clients of ours, and they work with other groups. I actually think the two media organizations that are doing probably the best place, if you want to read news reports about criminal justice reform, it's this thing called the Marshall Project. It was created by a man, David Keller, who used to be the lead publisher of also the lead editor of the New York Times. He retired from the New York Times and then created this specific Journalistic, it's only online. I don't think they publish in paper. It's a virtual journalistic organization that publishes only on criminal justice reform. So when I want to kind of understand what's happening in a given moment all across the country, you can sign up for their press announcements. I think they're really quite good, and they're really thorough. They're kind of a synthesis of often what else is out there, and they do some of their own research and writing. The other group that I think has done some really good investigative work is ProPublica. If you know that, that's the investigative research organization, also out of New York. And they have a number of people on staff who are both, whose background is in criminal justice reform and who are trained in it. And so those are two outlets that I think have begun to kind of set the pace. But you're right, we need to do much more of it. And part of your point, to close on this, part of the reason why I focus on this and telling the stories of individuals in jails and in prisons is when you think about the way that we have structured incarceration in America, it is done with our money, right? They tax us and we pay a lot of money in taxes that often should go to schools and roads and often end up in the wrong places, bombs and prisons, in my mind. But there are money, it's our money's being spent on this. And yet there's some of the most opaque places where you can't really tell what's going on with your taxpayer dollars. You know, you have much better ways of knowing what's going on through the public schools because you have local school boards. You can go down to the local schools. You can be involved in the schools if you're a teacher. You can be involved in the PTA. Those public institutions spending your tax dollars, they may not be perfect, but they're at least more transparent to you. Good luck with prisons and jails, right? They are purposely out of sight, out of mind. We build these facilities, sometimes very far away from urban centers so that the people don't have access to lawyers and don't have access to journalists. You don't know what goes on behind those walls by design. There's very little transparency on a major part of government operations. And part of what I think we need to do is we need to crack open these closed spaces that unless they're open, the conditions are too ripe for abuse and for abuse of power and for mistreatment of people. And the more that we can kind of shed the light into what our detention centers and jails look like, the more people will engage and say, well, that ain't right. And what can we do to fix that? And that's part of the reason why I think this is one of the top priorities for us at the ACLU, and I dare say a top issue for all of us. I thank you for your patience, I thank you for your questions, and thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you so much for that. You know, as challenging as these issues are, as difficult as it is going to be to confront them and begin to resolve them, I think I'm most struck by your comments about there not being a place for cynicism and the importance of trying to avoid that cynicism. And this has been a truly compelling conversation. I think it's been really wonderful and energizing. And so for that, thank you so much. Thank you again for coming out this evening. Stay tuned to the ACLU of Montana and to the Wheeler Center for future events. Thank you again. Travel safely. Good night.